In a company like IBM, we've got 21,000 first line managers. As we think about well being at work, we cannot underestimate the role of that people leader, that manager.
Welcome to Lead From Within, the podcast for people leaders that explores the fascinating intersection of mental health, leadership, and performance. Hello, I'm Dr. Nick Taylor, and welcome to this episode of Lead From Within. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Nickle LaMoreaux, CHRO at IBM. Nickle has spent her career rising the ranks at IBM and now leads their people strategy, skills, and employee experience. Her global HR team supports more than 250,000 IBMers across no fewer than 170 countries, such scale. Nicola is married with 3 children. During the pandemic, the family discovered their love of hiking, an activity they still enjoy today. Perhaps during this conversation, Nicola will be kind enough to share how I can get my children to go on walks. Nicola is also a fan of biographies, country music, and even the occasional 80s glam metal band, which I will try and get to in this conversation. Nicola, thank you so much for joining. How are you today?
It's wonderful to be here, Nick.
Super. Well, I would love to ask, if you don't mind, IBM is one of the most well-known organizations globally. It's such an important brand. And I wonder if you could tell people a little bit about IBM, about what it's like to be in IBM, what the organization is and does.
Yeah, so IBM is one of those brands that people recognize the name, but I do think it causes them to stop sometimes and wonder, but what do you do? I think you used to make computers, but you don't anymore. Um, IBM is an AI and hybrid cloud platform company in today's incarnation. We really have 3 main pieces of it. We are a software company, we are a hardware company. We also have a very large consulting business that helps our clients with their AI and hybrid cloud transformation. As you mentioned, we've got over 250,000 employees. We're still extremely global in 170 countries. And my team and I lead all things talent for the organization. So, from attracting, retention, retaining, benefits, and of course, we'll spend some time on well being as well.
When you think at that scale, it must be a real exercise of cognitive juggling to think about the individual and also think about 250,000 individuals.
I think this concept of macro, micro, standardization, customization, organization, individual is probably what, any large company senior leader spends most of their time on. Standardization is what allows for fairness and equity. It's what allows for speed, but you're right, it can lose the individual component. So, how do you think about when do you standardize? When do you customize? When do you think about the collective? When do you think about the individual? And the way we try to position this is 80% of what we do needs to be about the collective, needs to be about the large organization, but we have to allow room for that 20%. We have to allow room for the customization to the individual when appropriate so that we can make them feel like they want to be part of the collective. And so it's that balance that we're constantly solving for.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear you describe that. And I'm sure there'll be many more balances that we're going to dig into because so much of life is about the balance, isn't it? And before I do move into that territory, I'd love to learn more about you and your life. And could you tell us a little bit about you growing up? Could you tell us about your life outside of IBM and who you are?
Sure, absolutely. So I can tell you that when I was a little girl, I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a small town north of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I did not know anything about human resources, and I did not think I was going to be a corporate human resources professional, but my life kind of took me that way. So I have a brother and sister. My family is extremely important to me, so we were very close, and nature was always part of our life growing up. Like I said, I grew up in a very rural community. I got an opportunity to go to university, and my plan was to go to law school. I felt very strongly about employment law, but that's where I felt intellectually challenged. But a strange thing happened along the way. As a university student, I realized I didn't have any money. And so I took an internship with IBM in their HR department. And it was supposed to be a very short detour, get some money before I went on to law school. And what I fell in love with were, the global nature of the work, the challenge of the work, like what we just talked about, this idea of when do you standardize and when do you customize. But I also fell in love with the people. IBMers for me are a very special group of professionals. And so that's how I got where I am. So from intern to a little more than 20 years later, I am now the head of human resources. And for me, that journey has been very special. I've been in every area of HR, virtually every area of the business that I spoke about: services, sales, software. And I even had an opportunity to do two international assignments in Shanghai, China during my tenure. So, a little bit about me and my journey.
When you go back to that, the young version of yourself, the child, and you, I always think it's interesting with hindsight to look back and say, oh, actually, now I can see how that led me there, or that personality trait enabled me to do this. And it's really interesting, like almost retrospectively putting the pieces in place. Do you feel that now when you think about law school and then you took the role because you think about finance and then suddenly you're like, oh, actually, I love this because was it obvious to you?
There are a couple things in my childhood that I think shaped this. Um, My parents were very kind of hands on, what I will call problem solvers. We didn't have a lot of money, but they were people that believed that, there was always a way, and, hard work mattered. Um, so for me, watching them, they built our childhood home that we live in. They really were very strong believers. If you want something, work hard for it. So I think that I learned that from them. I also think that they both did things that they were passionate about, and it wasn't necessarily driven by money or fame or success. And, maybe a little known fact about me is my parents actually had a side business growing up. They made baskets. And I know that seems very unusual, but for them, that was something that they enjoyed and were passionate about. And so I think watching them do that made me realize that maybe it was more important to find the thing that really excites you.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I was reading something recently exactly to that message, which is, they were saying the best career advice you could ever give someone is find someone to pay you for the thing you love doing. And I love that idea that if you're aligned, I think the Japanese concept is ikigai, to your sense of purpose and direction in your life, but combined with hard work, that's the critical part. Then you can have an incredible career.
I think that is the critical part, that both of those things have to be true.
Do you think yourself, who had just arrived at IBM, would believe that here you are today as the CHRO, part of the exec team? Do you think that would have been comprehensible, or did that seem like a totally different world?
No. The intern that joined IBM just was trying to, as I said, maybe make a little money, not get fired, see what this HR thing was all
Yeah.
about. But again, and we can talk a little bit more about this, but I kept getting new opportunities to build my skills, and it was just something that was intoxicating.
I can well imagine that. And there's an interesting thing about as you're growing as a professional, you're, at least in my experience, often putting yourself in a position of unknown, and slightly almost, it's like when you're learning to swim and you're walking out of into the sea, your tiptoes are kind of touching the sand. It's a little bit uncomfortable, but by putting yourself there, you're learning to swim. And there's something about that discomfort that is integral to the growth journey for everyone. Tell me about, like, I guess it's often talked about with imposter syndrome, or a sense of anxiety that people can have as they are pushing boundaries in their own career. Was that something you battled with or thought about, or?
Yeah, look, I think what I struggled with maybe was a little bit of less about the imposter syndrome, but that that the pressure of being in such an iconic company, and what a privilege that is, but also, I mean, candidly, not wanting to mess it up.
Yeah.
And so for me, it wasn't necessarily did I earn to be in this seat. Luckily, I had amazing colleagues and mentors that were more about building me up than kind of pointing out flaws. So I felt comfortable at each opportunity that I deserved to be there. But in such an iconic company with such a large workforce, you know, um, pressure is a privilege, as they often say, but that for me was what I wanted to make sure that every decision, every action that we take, am I living up to adding to this kind of iconic company?
Yeah, I really love that. When you mentioned mentors, mentors can have such a profound impact on our lives. How did you find a mentor? Like, what was it that when you would realize, oh, this person's actually been an amazing mentor? What were the characteristics they brought to you to enable them to mentor you?
I know when I talk to a lot of people, they talk about, well, organizational mentorship programs. And we had some amazing mentorship where we were paired up early in my career, even now as a senior person in the company. But for anybody who's listening, if your company doesn't have a formal mentor program, make one. Do it anyway. It doesn't need to be a formal program to ask somebody that you respect to be a mentor. Look, if I look back on my mentors, and I've had many over my career, formal, informal, assigned, ones that I've sought out, there's a couple things that I think have been enduring, but maybe one of the biggest characteristics. And that is, are they a truth teller?
Hmm.
Are they willing to very candidly share with me their perspectives, what I might want to consider doing differently or better? Are they willing to tell me when I'm not showing up the way I aspire to show up? I mean, some of the mentors I've had are the people that have been willing to say some of the most difficult things to me in search of kind of my growth. And so I know a lot of people look for mentors because they want people that are like them or people that might affirm things, but make sure you have at least one mentor that can be that truth teller to you. Now, not a place of just of constant criticism, but from a place of how can I help you be better?
And do you think to achieve, because that makes a lot of sense to me, do you think to achieve that, you also have to be willing to put yourself in a vulnerable place to your mentor? Because they need to know you. They need to know your anxieties, your hopes, your fears, all, and what you're aspiring to, the situation you're in. You've got to open the gates to them, really.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I think that ability to be honest with a mentor is maybe one of the most critical factors from the mentee side. And so then I'll even take one step further. Before you can be honest with anybody else, you also have to be honest with yourself. As we talk often about career development, career aspirations at IBM, one of the pieces of advice that I give people is to be truly honest with themselves about what motivates them. And I acknowledge this may change over the course of your career. This is not a forever statement, but so many people that are unsatisfied with their careers. What I sometimes find is The root cause is they're not honest about what really motivates them. And, if money is what motivates you, say it, but also choose professions that can fulfill that. If affiliation with your colleagues is the most important thing to you and not money, that's okay too. No judgment. But seek out teams then that will provide you that.
That's such an important point. Seek out teams that will provide you that, because in knowing yourself in that way, and being articulating it to yourself, you can then find the environment in which you'll thrive. Because I suspect I'd be awful as a trader on a trading floor, for example. I don't think that culture would necessarily fit with my character. Lots of friends in those worlds, but it's just not who I am. So I would not thrive there. So, but knowing yourself and then seeking out the environment in which you can thrive is incredibly important.
Absolutely. And look, I share this about myself of where I am, in my career. Money is not a driver for me. I would even say affiliation isn't necessarily a driver for me. Decision making is. So it doesn't matter where I am in the organization, I want to be in a position to make decisions and
Yeah.
contribute to decisions. And so if I know that's a driver for me, how do I build a career that is going to satisfy that? So again, early in my career, flexibility was a driver for me. I had, a young family, 3 children. And so this is where I say is it can shift over time, but be honest, you know, one on this point of decision making. I remember at one point in my career, I was a little frustrated that I wasn't in a role that I felt had the decision making ability. And when I went in to talk to my manager about it, I wasn't honest that that's what I wanted. I was worried that that made me sound egotistical or that I knew more than other people. And so I had this very veiled conversation with my manager, who then turned around the next day and gave me a salary increase.
Hmm.
And it was actually the worst thing, because my manager didn't know what problem that we were solving for. And so it was a lesson I learned early in my career that really evaluate for yourself what drives you, and don't be embarrassed about it. Again, if it's status, if it's money, just be honest about whatever that is. And then think about how you make decisions that put you in a place that are going to give you that motivation.
I love that guidance. It's really, really brilliant. And if someone came to you and said, um, "Can you help me know how to make good decisions?" Like, if decision making is something that really drives you, and you're passionate about, like, what is your approach to decision making, and how do you manage the cognitive demand that it must put on you over a long day?
So when I think about decisions, I think about, on one hand, getting as many diverse inputs as possible, but also realizing you'll never have 100% perfection on all the information. So you have to kind of really deal with both of those things that are a little bit of cognitive dissonance of always wanting to get more input and making sure that there isn't something you're missing, but knowing that in any decision, speed is probably pretty important. And so realizing that there's always some inherent risk in decision making. I also think about when you make decisions to think about what's the worst that can happen.
Right.
A, to prepare yourself for, hey, have I thought through if I make this decision and it doesn't work out, what is the recovery plan? And I just think that's prudent risk taking. But also sometimes is it can relieve some of the pressure of decision making from you to say, wait, if that's the worst that can happen, okay, maybe this decision isn't as risky as I'm making it sound. So for me, there's some of that that also goes into decision making and how you think about it. Maybe the last thing I would say is there are very few decisions you make in the world that are final. And so knowing that decision making is a constant process. It's more of a evolution than just a solution. And so as you get more input, as circumstances change, what's the next set of decisions you need to make?
Thank you very much for sharing those. I'm interested in the way in which different decisions can demand a different speed of response or level of clarity, and the way you articulated it is really helpful actually for guiding those as well. So thank you so much. If I could move us now into your role day to day, can you give us an insight into where your focus is and how and what plates are you spinning in your day to day?
So, look, if I think about IBM's overall talent strategy, strategically, programmatically, where do we spend a lot of time? It is on this idea of skills.
Right.
People are our biggest asset. Labor is our biggest investment in the company. And, I mentioned earlier, we've got a tremendous iconic history. We're over 110 years old. And a tech company only survives that long if it is continuing to change with the times. So I spend a lot of time on how do you get employees to continue to evolve and change, whether it's in mindsets, ways of working, skill building. So programmatically and at a very basic level, everything that we're doing is really lined up to that. How do we have our employees be their best in the short term, but also be working to evolve to what they need to in kind of the medium to long term?
Do you think that then permeates across the different areas of focus for you then? For every topic you're approaching, it's really about growth, individual growth and team growth and
Absolutely. And it is this mindset also of short term growth. What is needed for right now? What are the gaps that might need to be filled? How do we have people show up and optimize for their best? But also on the at the same time they're doing that, you also have to be pointing them to the future, which may be something different. How do you get them excited about that and managing along that journey? So absolutely, that is a huge piece of the job.
with your role, do you kind of find yourself talking on this theme on a daily basis, or is it embedded in the values, or how does it come to life?
Yeah, I think it is really embedded in everything that we do, but it also goes back to this point that you brought up at the beginning of, global company, organizational, but then individual. So, how do we have enough options at the organizational level where we know it's not going to be a one size fits all? 250,000 employees. We can't say, here's a skill building program and it's one program and it fits everybody. So, what is that right number of programs that we can provide without providing too many that get at the individual level, the most individual? So, we are always saying, is there a group that we're missing? Is there something that is duplicative where we've got two programs that should be combined to one to make it simpler and easier? But this idea of making sure that as we're building these programs, we have enough to reach the breadth of our employees, but not having too many that it becomes chaos.
Yeah, there's something very interesting about the cultural aspect as well. Yeah, so I have a 5-year-old daughter, and she now routinely says to me, "I can't do that yet," because she's learning at 5 years old about growth mindset, and that she can grow into. Now, what's so interesting about that is I remember a few years ago, a friend of mine in California telling me that his daughter had started saying that, and I remember thinking, that's interesting. I wonder if that is a Californian educational cultural piece. And now I find myself in deep darkest Hampshire in the UK with my daughter saying the same. But it speaks to the role that education has as a child and how you then take the world on, really, and that would then permeate throughout your entire life and career. And there are so many nuances and cultural differences that we have in our education, we have in our religions, we have in our philosophies, and I wonder for you with managing such an incredible global community, how you think about the nuance in relation to kind of a growth mindset and re-upping our skills and developing for a future world.
Yeah, and we do an element of this of what we would kind of say local and then organizational, because as you say, there are different local nuances. We have a group of behaviors that we call the IBM growth behaviors. And they do have key components that, regardless of your job, regardless of how technology evolves, regardless of how business evolves, we think are kind of enduring for IBMers. One of them is this idea of a growth mindset.
Hmm.
Second one is trust. We talk about being resourceful. You're always going to have limited resources. So how do you make the most of what you have? And so we spend a lot of time training and educating around these behaviors. We do it at a what I'll call a universal level, but then we also take it down to a country level or even a job role level. What does it mean to build trust if you're a seller? What does it mean to have a growth mindset if you're an HR professional? What does it mean to be resourceful in India? And given the education and the background that people have grown up with there versus to be resourceful in Canada. And so we really do these kind of global programs, but we also do local.
Staying on that theme of global and local, I'm really interested in perhaps starting here. But what are your learnings about global well-being as a topic? So specifically, you know, think not well-being from a geographical perspective. What's different to how you thought it might be, say 5 or 10 years ago?
Yeah. So when we think about well being kind of on a global stage, I think there's a couple things that are different. I think that many companies that had well being programs even 10 years ago, maybe five in some cases, thought about them as a tops down well being, kind of maybe narrow in scope. I think what we are learning as we get into well being is that there are many dynamics at play here, and it's much more nuanced and it's much broader than we ever thought. And so what we think about is how do you take kind of the best from around the world and have kind of those core pillars of well-being programs. But then how do you also make sure that you customize it locally to either cultural dynamics that exist, family dynamics that exist, socioeconomic dynamics, because all of that contributes. I think the other thing that we've learned that we've had to just acknowledge is that openness to talking about this, openness to being honest to our earlier conversation about well being does differ.
Hmm.
Some of that is by country, some of that might be by generation, some of it might be just based on the individual and personal preferences and personal experiences. And so we also have to make well-being programs that are available kind of in a private manner if that is what is important to you. Or some people do their best on their well-being journey in a cohort, sharing that experience with others. So how do you also then make sure you've got offerings that allow for a more public viewing of this? And so for us, we're constantly learning. This is an area where there is not a one size fits all. I know it's probably overstated too much. You do have to meet people where they are in particular on this. And that's what our programs aim to do.
It's been very interesting hearing you talk, and it's kind of triggered a few thoughts from my side. One is there's a very interesting book about the globalization of the medicalized model of mental health and the impact that has on different cultures and how they use language differently to think about topics that historically would have been thought about in a different way. So that's very interesting to think about the nuance of even the language that we're thinking about in relation to well-being and health. And then the other thing that I think is really fascinating is the the way in which language is used in relation to well-being. So we hear well-being, we hear health programs, we hear what does well-being mean at IBM, and how, if at all, do you distinguish between well-being and, say, mental health, or do you see them as encompassing one another?
Yeah, so look, we think about well-being as having multiple pieces of this. It has your physical health, it has financial health, it has purpose or spiritual health, so it's very broad. Because for any one individual, again, I think we would all agree that those are the big pillars of well-being, but you might care more about your physical health. I might care more about purpose. It is a little different by individual which of those pillars has what share in your well-being journey, right? So we do talk about it as a much more encompassing framework, and then that's where we make sure that we have programs and offerings under each piece of that. Again, global, but also by country. And then what is available in a more public setting, and then where are there personalized offerings you may want to take advantage of.
Yeah.
I think the great news about where we are on well being, and then there are some challenges with where we are on well being. But I think on one hand, we often talk about the pandemic really changed how people think about work. And it's why we're having all the conversations we are about hybrid work, because your personal life and your professional life collided into one, right? And so it's caused us to reframe. I actually think this idea of well being is also a piece that has come out of the pandemic in hopefully what I view as a long term positive way, that all of a sudden now this was a topic that we could talk about because your personal life and your professional life had collided in new ways. And people were being tested and stressed in different ways. And so it became part of the conversation. I know, Nick, you often talk about human potential, right? And so as we think about organizations, we want to have our employees as high performing employees. Well, making sure that they've got the domain expertise and the professional skills is one piece of this. But this idea of well being, whatever it is underneath, physical, mental, financial, purpose, all of that also has to exist in order to be the foundation for everything else to build off of.
I think that's so well said. Actually, there's a very important author called a man called Lord Layard, and he was actually instrumental in how the National Health Service was structured in the UK around treating mental health, and he's done a huge amount of research on this topic and written many papers and books. One of the things he talks about, which I think is very compelling, is similar to what you just described, really, which is that well-being in itself is subjective. It's how we essentially are feeling. To an extent, it's how happy we are at any given time, and people will say the greatest determinant of their sense of well-being is their physical health and their mental health. Mental health being the first, they say, above physical health. And ultimately, by having good mental health and therefore having good well-being and therefore feeling happier, we are fundamentally more effective in everything we do. So we're more likely to have a growth mindset. We're more likely to take something on. We're more likely to believe in ourselves. And I find that business case is so critical around this topic, because I agree, like, the stigma has fallen away, and I think um, the silver lining of the health pandemic with COVID is that people talk more openly, I think, around topics of well-being at work, and we've amalgamated our lives. But actually, now I think we really need to remind the business leaders of the world that this isn't just about the goodness of people feeling well, but fundamentally it impacts on the business as well. Do you think that? Do you agree with that, or do you think that's the right way of thinking about it?
Totally agree. And I think that for many companies, this point you made, particularly on mental health and having that be kind of the first thing, prior to the pandemic, many companies would have had programs around financial health and physical health,
Hmm.
right? And it was very comfortable space for corporations to be in. Oh, financial health, you need assistance there? No problem. Retirement savings, we'll set you up, and there are many options for you as an employee. And it was very comfortable for them to also be in the physical health space, whether it was health benefits that were provided from a medical perspective. Or even think about this, many companies, teams did step challenges and workout challenges. And, that was a very comfortable space. What wasn't comfortable until the pandemic for most companies was this idea of how do you talk about mental health at work? It's easy to talk to Nickel about, does she get 10,000 steps a day? It's a little harder to talk about Nickel saying, I feel a little depressed.
That's kind of the elephant in the room, isn't it?
Yes, that is the big unlock of, how do you make it okay for people to talk about that, to articulate that? How do you make it so that you can get resources and help to people quickly? Um, And our perspective on this is it's not just about all being on the individual. So we will make sure that there are doors that individuals can enter through. But a couple years ago, kind of out of the pandemic, we actually created a certification at IBM called the Mental Health Ally Certification. And this was this idea that wherever you are on your mental health spectrum, knowing that it could change daily, um, we wanted, as IBM colleagues, to make sure that we were here for each other. And so this is where we did some of the training that you talk about on things like language. We made sure that every IBMer, as part of the certification, understood what resources were available, by country and at the global level. We trained them on how to talk about this in the workplace. And then lastly, we also train people to understand the limits of this allyship. If somebody is in a severe mental health crisis, what do they do? How do they help their colleague? Where do they send them? And so for us, this was a big unlock of kind of training the organization on this so that we all could get better and kind of support one another.
That sounds really inspiring and ticks all the boxes in terms of fostering that environment. Because you're right, it's not just about the individual; it's about the setting that individual is in and the relationships and that right time care is so critical as well. And particularly given that we know that if someone gets the right care at the right time, the outcomes of psychological therapy, for example, are very high from an intervention perspective and can get somebody back on their feet feeling how they want to feel really successfully. And by kind of unshackling the topic from the stigma, we allow people to more easily get to the right care at the right time, so long as the services are there for people to access. You've mentioned throughout this conversation a few things that I think thematically link, like the mentor piece, the importance of training leaders, etc. And I really want to get your sense of an opinion on the managers piece. Like, how do we? What is the? And you mentioned empathy as well. What is the role of a manager? How can we have what would the best manager for well-being look like from your perspective?
Managers really are everything for their employees. And I think this is really important because I think in many organizations, because domain expertise is becoming so important, managers are becoming job managers. You can ask them questions about how to get their job done, task, solve problems for you, but we may be losing some of the people management, the people leadership out of that manager category. And I think we've got to bring some of this back. Again, domain expertise in business is really important. And so managers do have to do that. But I think we have gravitated a little too much in many organizations towards that. And so we aren't spending enough time on managers training up on well-being and how do they unlock the human potential? How do they point employees at resources? How do they have real conversations about career and growth and some of the attributes that we've talked about to make jobs more fulfilling? I think that is the piece that we've got to get more in balance so that managers aren't just job managers. And why I think that is important is They are the ultimate, going back to the beginning of our conversation, they are the ultimate localization.
Yeah.
In a company like IBM, we've got 21,000 first line managers. They are the stewards that can be there for their team to make sure that the programs that my team is launching globally actually work at the individual level, right? And so this is a huge unlock as we think about well-being at work. We cannot underestimate the role of that people leader, that manager.
For some reason, as you were talking, I started thinking about the word nurturing. Like, we need our managers to like nurture their teams, to really kind of care for them and manage, like help build them up. To your point about one of your mentors being there in your corner, having honest conversations, but supporting you in your career, the manager has such an opportunity to nurture and get the best to reach their team to reach their full potential. And it's a really exciting opportunity.
Absolutely. And it's not one size fits all. What one member of the team may need may be different than another team, and that is that ability to customize. Managers are the only answer we have in this ability to customize as we think about this.
I agree with that. And what it makes me think about as well is this, um, it doubles down, I guess, in my mind, this idea that when we're thinking about how to enable our managers to get the best out of their people, it's not about training them about mental ill health. They might want to know that as part of the toolbox they have, but it's really about like knowing how to look after the team's well-being. It's about how to help them achieve their goals with their growth mindset, or how to know what they want to get out of work so that they can be really clear about seeking the environment where they're going to thrive. It's a really broad role, and it requires a huge amount of kind of empathy and kindness from a manager, which in turn is a huge ask when managers are often just balancing so many things and often don't feel they have enough time. I don't know if you saw, but in the Harvard Business Review, there's an article all about, you know, running out of empathy. Essentially, how do we mitigate that as a risk? How do we make sure managers look after themselves first? I know you've spoken about that in the past as well. Like, what can we do to, in addition to asking our managers to look after their team, build their teams up, look after themselves?
Yeah, and this is, I think, really important. And look, to me, this goes all the way up the line. So a second line manager, an upline manager needs to be looking out for their team, right? Who are first line managers. And so I think this is one of these things when we think about well-being is ensuring that it is happening even at the top of the organization, role modeling, but that's how you look after your teams in the right way.
Yes, absolutely, and that role modeling piece. But then it comes back to culture, doesn't it? Which is that we need to be in a culture that gives permission to role model those behaviors, where we're looking after ourselves, we're recharging, we're making it clear that we're prioritizing our well-being in that moment because it will make us a better colleague to our team, for example.
One of the more surprising things, we had a new CEO in early 2020 during the height of the pandemic, and he did all employee broadcast on a monthly basis as part of his being newly appointed as part of his tenure. One of his first broadcasts, he said in passing about how sleep was really important to him and that he did everything he could to try to get 8 hours of sleep a night, that was how he recharged, that was important for his well-being. That is an example of people heard that. I mean, he said lots of really important things during that webcast, right? But that was the thing that stuck with people. That here is a very senior person who isn't bragging about pulling all-nighters or how little sleep they need to, and but just being very honest about something that was important to them in their well-being. And I think that's an example of it then gave others of us permission to talk about what's important in our well-being and what we make time for outside of work. And so I think that that's a really small example, but it has a massive ripple effect if you can get your leaders talking about that, acknowledging that it may not be the same for every leader.
Do you know what I love about that example is that I think often when we talk about leaders leading in the topic, for example, around mental health, we can all think of really courageous individuals who have shared their lived experience of mental ill health, and that has helped to destigmatize the topic. But I'm always also really hoping that leaders will speak about things such as the importance of sleep, because it's a more preventative focus. It's a more um, preventative first approach to mental health, and it's also linking mental health more to performance as well, which I think is really important, because linkages reduce the stigma around the topic. It shouldn't always be the realm of problems when the topic of mental health comes up, and if a leader can model that, I think it can be transformational.
Absolutely.
I would love to ask about the future of work from your perspective. There's a transformation going on around us with AI. There is all sorts of predictions about the future of work from a hybrid perspective, the introduction of virtual reality, all of these kind of extraordinary ideas, which seem once upon a time to have been the future, are now quickly approaching the modern world. What's your prediction for the future of work at IBM and some of those trends?
Yeah, so look, AI is here, and AI is going to be a platform that is going to change all of our jobs. Doesn't mean that all of our jobs are going to go away. In fact, I predict that very few jobs are going to be completely eliminated. The bigger challenge that is ahead of us on AI is, if all of our jobs are going to change, how are we getting skilled for that? Are we prepared for that? I think of AI is a platform, a tremendously powerful platform. It is like the internet. It is like email. It's going to be how we all get our jobs done. And so I think that's a big piece of it. And again, if I think about well-being, there's maybe two pieces that we should think about when we think about AI. One is there is this innate fear of job loss, and that certainly affects many people who are scared that that will happen. And so I really encourage all organizations to be very clear with employees about how AI is transforming jobs in their company, to give some maybe relief to employees that, hey, small pieces are changing. And with the time you free up, here's what we want you to do about it. If AI is helping you save an hour in your job in the next 12 months, here's where you should spend that hour. Here are the skills that are important instead. So giving people this roadmap, I think, really takes down the temperature a little bit around the fears of AI. I'm also really excited. The thing that AI allows is it does allow massive customization. And so I think we all know, there are a lot of well-being platforms out there, and they are part of the toolkit to help people get, these global in the hands of an individual. My hope is that a lot of these platforms start to adopt AI components to them, so that their offerings, things that are targeted, can be very different. What I see on a platform is very specific to what I need versus what you see in the platform. And so I know there's a lot of scared people out there. I know there are a lot of people that are really apprehensive and a little doomsday about AI, but I think it can help us unlock some of this human potential. It doesn't replace it.
Yeah, I'm so well put. And in relation to the first point, I think that transparency to employees about AI in the way you've described is incredibly helpful to create more safety around the topic. And then in relation to the second point, I totally agree. It doesn't replace the human, but AI can deliver a more personalized mental health support or well-being support more broadly. And I think also we are, if you think about the world of mental health, there was an issue with access still globally. If you think about all the countries you operate in, there's not an equal distribution of therapists across those organizations, and there's different levels of stigma. And actually, AI can be deployed in a very meaningful way to help people get the right care at the right time, which is essential to good health outcomes of intervention. So I think AI is incredibly exciting, but has to be done in the right ethical way. So the World Health Organization recently published guidelines of generative AI in healthcare and how it should be applied, and making sure that approach, that scientific first ethical approach, is applied to the application. But I remain incredibly excited about the role it plays in the future of well-being.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Nick, I think you hit on, something else. I mean, AI is one thing we're looking towards for the future, but as you and I have been talking about, mental health is also evolving. And if I think about workplace mental health, workplace well being, I do have three hopes like you for the future. One is this idea of we still need to do work around the world on destigmatizing this. How do you openly talk about it in the workplace in particular? Again, not just destigmatizing it in society or around the dinner table, but how is it also destigmatized in the workplace? The second thing is we do need more coverage. There are still pockets, there are still offerings where, resources are scarce and we can't get them at scale to the people that need them. And then third, even in places where we've got resources for well-being, there isn't enough diversity in providers. And so, I think that one of the things that is important about getting to a good place on workplace health is making sure that, employees that are seeking help find providers that, look like them and can better relate. And so those are three things that are still my wish as we're on this journey.
Yeah, and it's incredibly important, and as part of that is the choice of who you speak to, and the reality is with mental health care, there's still a lot of catching up to do with physical healthcare globally, but I think those three priorities that you've articulated are spot on, and I'm totally aligned with you on them. I wonder, thank you so much for your time today, and I know we're coming towards the end of the conversation, but if you have any recommendations for people of a book or a podcast that you've listened to recently that you think would be worth them having a listen to.
Related to mental health, although some of your listeners may not think that right at the beginning, but a book and a podcast. So there's a book called The Third Door by Alex Banyan. And it really is about resilience. It is about growth mindset. It is about this belief that there's always a way. And so it is about hope and how different leaders in corporate settings have used that mindset to do some pretty remarkable things. So that's a book I would recommend. And then the podcast I would recommend is Revisionist History by Malcolm Gladwell. And from my perspective, it really is about this concept of, what does hindsight give you? It gives you some perspective and perspective versus reality. And I think that many times when we talk about well being, we're in a position where we're seeing the world through a different lens or a certain lens. And sometimes we need to take a step back and see it through another lens. And so, again, it's all about mindset, it's all about perspective. And so, those would be two that I would recommend to your listeners.
Nickle, thank you very much. Brilliant recommendations. And I look forward to buying the book myself after this. So thank you so much for joining the conversation today. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.
Great being with you, Nick.
Thank you for listening to Lead From Within, brought to you by Unmind. Subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Leave us a like and please do review if you found it valuable. Follow Unmind on LinkedIn for updates on all things regarding leadership, performance, and well-being. To find out more about Unmind's workplace well-being solutions for enterprise businesses, please go to unmind.com. That's unmind.com. Thank you and see you next time.